Okay, it's 7 o'clock and I say welcome to our SDS Thursday. SDS Thursdays are presented to you by SDS Seminars. We are a UK-based training company, training in psychological skills and CPD, and we've been going for over 30 years. I would like to start probably with some questions which I have for Paul. And first of all, Paul, can we start with getting the terminology right? Because lots of people I know confuse jealousy and envy, and very often use two terms interchangeably. In your opinion, what's the difference between jealousy and envy?
Right. Welcome, folks, by the way. It's good to see so many people here again on at least this rather cold and chilly evening here in Sussex. Wherever you are, it might not be so chilly, but it's certainly chilly here this evening where I am. Yeah, to say a little bit about jealousy and how people end up confusing it with envy. So where to start here? I think the key thing to bear in mind is that jealousy is about an anticipated threat, whereas envy is a response to something that it's perceived that somebody else already has. So jealousy is basically related to the feeling that someone might try and take away what's yours, and that the jealous response is a response, as I said, to an anticipated threat. Envy is where we believe that somebody already has something which has enabled them to achieve an advantage over us. And often that's perceived, by the way, as occurring unfairly, and we resent their success. Largely, I think, because we believe it reflects poorly on us. So in a peculiar way, jealousy is about what we think might be happening in the future. Envy is about what we think somebody else has already got in some particular way. I mean, there are obviously overlaps between the two, and some of the underlying beliefs that underlie both of these sort of responses really are shared, but that's the primary difference between the two, just as a starting point.
So let me just check with you that I'm getting it right. So jealousy is not only about romantic relationships.
Right. So jealousy tends to manifest itself most commonly in romantic relationships, and it's the area that people are most aware of. But no, it doesn't at all, and it can occur in a variety of contexts. So it can obviously occur, for instance, within family settings. So there's issues around, for example, in terms of jealousy towards other sibs, and also issues around regarding jealousy towards other family members. So, for instance, one partner being jealous of a child and their relationship, for instance, with their partner, adult partner, but it can also occur in other contexts as well, where children can be jealous of a third party who has a relationship with one of their parents, and where they feel jealous towards that. So it can occur easily in family settings as well, but tends to be, maybe not surprisingly, most commonly recognized or talked about in romantic relationships. The other thing just to mention here, and it applies equally as well to issues of envy, is that it can also occur in a work context too. Jealousy can occur within teams, and jealousy can occur between teams. And I'm sure anyone who either currently or has worked in an organizational context in the past will be more than aware of instances where jealousy has actually occurred with regard to other team members or towards other teams, or where somebody else is perceived as having obtained something which you yourself haven't obtained, and so on and so forth. So it's got relevance as well, I guess, for anyone that's actually doing work with organizations or team facilitation too. Yeah.
So can I just again double check? So you say jealousy is mainly anticipatory,
Yeah.
and envy is about something more objective. Is it correct?
Not necessarily more objective, probably more accurately to say something that's already happened.
Present,
So
something present.
envy is about a perceived loss or advantage that has already occurred, or is perceived to have already occurred. Jealousy is more about anticipation of something which will or might occur. So yeah, I think the time frame in many ways is probably the most important thing to try and grasp in terms of the difference between the two. Yeah.
Okay. So is jealousy always a problem? Can jealousy be seen as positive? Maybe motivational? Is it? Why do we see it as a problem?
Well, it's not always a problem. I guess the first thing I should actually say about this, and I think it's quite an important principle to grasp, is that there is a very strong evolutionary basis to jealousy. And in that respect, I think the first thing to recognize about jealousy is that it is normal and functional. And to be honest with you, in exactly the same way that the vast majority of responses that we actually have are. So just as it's not fundamentally wrong to feel anxious, and there's an evolutionary basis to feeling anxious, for instance, there's an evolutionary basis and logic to actually feeling jealous. And let me just explain a little bit about that, if that sounds slightly strange. It's got an evolutionary basis to it because to survive, you've got to win against perceived competition. That's how we have actually evolved. And there's two particular contexts, I think, where that is relevant. So the first one relates to something that's called parental investment theory, which is, this is where we're talking about jealousy, primarily romantic jealousy between adults, whereby there is an evolutionary logic to being jealous about the idea that somebody else may capture your partner. One of the things that's quite interesting about that, I mean, we go into a bit more detail about this on the actual main event, but one of the things that's quite interesting about this, I'll just mention now, is that that fear of loss of a partner, for quite clear historical evolutionary reasons, has tended to lead to slightly different types of jealousy between males and females. So, and this is very, very broad brush, but broadly speaking, on the whole, males tend to exhibit far more sexual jealousy, whereas women on the whole tend to manifest much more of what's called attachment jealousy or emotional involvement jealousy by a third party. But there isn't, just what I want to emphasize here is that this idea of parental investment theory, which I'll say a little bit more about on the actual event, is one of the reasons. The other thing is pretty straightforward from an evolutionary basis, which is competition for limited resources. So this helps us to understand, for example, jealousy in sibs, and also jealousy in infants. We know, for example, that we have got a couple of very good studies which clearly show that 6-month-old infants manifest distress and attempt to attract their mother's attention more when the mother interacts with another baby. And you might say, well, isn't this just about issues of attention? And the brief answer is no, it's not, because you don't get the same response when mother is actually interacting with a non-human object. So this idea of, in this particular example, of being jealous of a resource, in this instance, the mother, and the fear that someone else might take that away is primed from a very, very, very early age. And that obviously manifests itself subsequently in a whole range of settings, and it also manifests itself obviously in adulthood as well, but it starts off at that particular point. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, that's I'll just touch on, in terms of context where jealousy can manifest itself, it can also obviously manifest itself in social and peer groups as well. So people can be jealous regarding friends and who's closer to whom and so on and so forth. So okay. Sorry, your question, was it always a bad thing? So it has an evolutionary basis to it. There's a logic to it. But, and here's the sort of key issue really that I think needs to be held on to. Although it's a natural, normal response, it's only really a problem when either it interferes with a relationship. It creates a problem for a relationship. And I'll come back in a moment about what it is that does create a problem in a relationship with this, or alternatively, where it dominates the person's life and their thinking. But the presence of jealousy per se, I don't think is a problem, in exactly the same way that anxiety per se is not a problem. It's when it starts having effects. So if I can just pick up those two particular elements, when I say it interferes with a relationship, one of the things that I will be saying a bit more about on the actual event itself is, in a peculiar way, people talk about jealousy as if it's an emotional problem. It's actually in many ways more accurately described, I'm going to argue, as being a cognitive and a behavioral problem, which I know sounds weird, but if I can just explain the behavioral side of it in a way. Feeling jealous is, I don't think, the thing that tends to create difficulties in relationships. It's the way the person behaves as a result of feeling jealous, which tends to create the difficulties. You know, whether we're talking here about double checking, whether we're talking about stalking, whether we're talking about, you know, giving a partner tests to test out their fidelity, you know, it's those behavioral expressions which tend to create the problems in the relationship. When I say the other problem is where it dominates the person's thinking and their life, a lot of the responses that people have to jealousy don't necessarily just manifest themselves in what the person does. So in that respect, it might not necessarily show itself to a partner, for example, that they're feeling jealous, although obviously it does in many instances. But there are other instances where it dominates the person's life. So I'm thinking here of things like rumination, for instance, which is a very, very common response to feeling jealous, where that continuous rumination and continuous worry and attempt almost at problem solving in your own head, and trying to gain some sort of certainty in yourself about, you know, what the hell is actually going on here is enormously distressing for a lot of people. And again, that manifests itself in a whole range of settings and ways of doing things. And I mean, as is always the case with these things, by the way, you know, you start becoming hypervigilant, you start looking out for examples that the person is behaving in ways which support your belief that your jealousy is justified. So again, it starts dominating your life in terms of what you're looking out for.
Yeah, well, as always with selective attention, you will find confirmations of things which you're looking for. You always will find them. And so if I understood you correctly, so on one hand, jealousy, when it expresses itself in a behavioral way, can have a serious detrimental impact on relationships. But on the other hand, even if it doesn't manifest as a behavior, it can have a serious impact on the person's well-being if they're ruminating and basically it's eating them up all the time. So the question is, why some people are more prone to jealousy than the others? Because we all know there are very jealous types, and then there are people who are not obsessing with it. So why is that?
Yeah, okay. There's a number of ways that you can go into this particular question. So let's start off with the stuff that I hope is more self-evident and pretty straightforward. So some people have different histories to others. So some people may have grown up in families where there's a history of jealousy, or where jealousy was manifested, and so that gives a very strong observational message to children that actually grow up in that particular environment. Maybe they've grown up in an environment where there's a history of competition within the family, either sibling competition. We've got some evidence, for instance, to indicate that children who have larger numbers of sibs are often more prone to jealousy in adulthood. And we also know as well that parental absence and that leading to competition for parental attention has some degree of effect. And also, maybe not surprisingly, where parents are differential in terms of how much affection they show to children also has an impact. So there's that personal history element that some people have. There's, not surprisingly for some people, a major issue regarding attachment, because really fundamentally one of the key sort of beliefs that individuals who are prone to jealousy often have is a fear of abandonment. And fear of abandonment, generally speaking, is not something that tends to come out of the blue in adulthood or even in later childhood. It's something which has developed because of issues of attachment earlier on. And so then moving from that, and why that occurs is obviously extremely variable, although I'll say a little bit about it later on. Now, not surprisingly, given those sorts of historical narratives, there are, from a CBT perspective, not surprisingly, some pretty key negative core beliefs that individuals develop, which lead them to end up being more prone to being jealous. So the belief that at the end of the day, I am somebody who is not worthy, somebody who is going to be abandoned, to develop core beliefs, for instance, that everyone's going to try and deceive me, everyone's going to leave me the first opportunity they get. All of those sorts of core beliefs, which develop most commonly as a result of parental and sibling relationships, tend to lead people to be more prone than others do. So that's a sort of background element of it. But there is another aspect to this which I do want to highlight, because I think it's one of the key things in a way which marks jealousy out, and where there's an aspect of CBT, certainly second wave CBT theory, which has got a lot to offer here. One of the things that's interesting, I've already mentioned that in some ways, it's not the feeling of jealousy that's the problem, it's the way the person responds to it. And that behavioral responses tend to create a lot of the relationship difficulties. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about jealousy is that it's a response to a perception where individuals very, very commonly engage in doing things which are designed to lessen the effect of, for example, the fear of abandonment, for instance. And so if we take something like checking, for instance, as just one particular example of this, checking is designed to lower my anxiety levels, but it doesn't work. I don't feel less anxious when I do this. You know, exactly, this is the really interesting thing. If I set my partner tests, even if they pass the test, somehow or other, I don't actually end up feeling less anxious. Now, as I describe this to you, anyone with a CBT background will say to themselves, this sounds suspiciously like a safety behavior. And you're quite right. And the thing that I wanted to emphasize, which we'll go into in a lot more depth on the actual event itself, is that jealousy, in my opinion, generates ineffective safety behaviors far more than a lot of other problems do. In fact, I think that safety behaviors are absolutely central to keeping the problem going. Now, why I'm mentioning this at this particular point in time is that we know from a CBT perspective that when safety behaviors exist, there's often a logic to phasing them out in some particular way or removing them for a whole variety of reasons, which I won't go into now, which I know a lot of CBT folk will be familiar with, but which I'm quite happy to touch base on for those of you that aren't familiar with that when we meet up for the main event. But I actually think they play a particularly important role with jealousy, to the degree that, in a very peculiar way, if you feel jealous but do not engage in these sorts of behaviors, and there's a whole range of them that people do engage in when they're jealous, I think in a way that is often quite sufficient to actually handle the jealousy problem. I'm quite happy to go so far as to say that I think behavioral responses to jealousy are the single biggest problem with feeling jealous. And that once you can get a handle on that, and you can find ways of managing it, which we'll be talking about, the feelings of jealousy don't end up being so powerful. They don't end up dominating your life. They don't end up disrupting the relationship and so on and so forth. I think there's a cognitive element as well, but which we will also spend some time on. But I think the thing I would want to emphasize in a peculiar way is that jealousy lends itself, from a therapeutic point of view, firstly and foremostly, to tackling the way the person responds to the feeling in terms of what they do, more than the feeling itself. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we actually meet up.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question which might sound slightly unusual and strange. As you remember, when we were creating this course on common life challenges, we did a survey of topics which therapists would like to attend and to have training in. And my gut instinct was that jealousy will be very high up on the list. And yet it wasn't. It seemed like, well, imposter syndrome, procrastination, perfectionism, self-esteem, they were all high up, and jealousy was somewhere in the middle. And it seems to me that, you know how lots of emotional responses and mental health issues are losing their sort of taboo issue, that taboo status, but jealousy is still something what people not easily admit or go to the therapist with. Is it right to say?
I think there's a number of things that operate here. I think that in the UK, well, the first thing to say is is to reiterate what I said earlier, which is that jealousy is often most strongly associated with romantic relationships. It does occur in families as well, and it does occur in other types of relationships, but it's most commonly comes to mind, I guess, as an issue in romantic relationships. And I think the first thing I would say about that is that certainly within the UK, there is not the same tradition as exists in certain other countries of people who have relationship problems actually coming to their therapist or counsellor for help on that. And if they do, it will be about a complaint about arguments, in inverted commas. People don't actually come along and say, I've got a problem with jealousy. They might say, my partner is very jealous. But even then, it's very commonly not the primary presenting problem. I think that's one issue. I think when you look at its manifestation in families, I think that there are certain other, there might be all sorts of problems that are occurring within a family, but I think in many ways it is distress and anxiety and behavioral problems which tend to get offered to therapists rather than I've got a child who is jealous, for instance. Or my partner is jealous of our son, or whatever it actually is. So I think problems tend to be presented in another way. And I think that there is a reason for this, which is that although, as I've said, there's an evolutionary logic to jealousy, I think that one of the things that exists today is that on the whole, people feel very embarrassed about admitting to feeling jealous. It's seen almost as an unacceptable response. It's seen as irrational in some way, and a sign of character weakness. So it's a very interesting point that you make, that although there's less taboo around about a lot of mental health issues, interestingly enough, I don't think that this is covered in the same way. And I think that plays a role in the way people actually present their problems to practitioners and therapists.
Yeah. Well, a lot of comments I'm reading are actually about jealousy within the families. Step parents jealous of their partner's children, children jealous of their relationship with the step parent, jealousy between siblings. So it is quite common, not just in romantic relationships, but as you said, it's not presented in that way very often, even though, and I guess it probably is quite difficult for the therapist to introduce the topic because it's sort of seen as such an unacceptable emotion, or it's not an emotion. What is it? What is jealousy? Is it an emotion?
Well, I would argue it's primarily cognitive. I would argue it's primarily cognitive. It's about a set of beliefs about what you think may well happen or is going to happen. Obviously, there are strong. Well, that's an interesting point, because that's worth mentioning about why it's not an emotion. Because if you actually think about the emotional response that individuals have in connection with jealousy, it's not one emotion. There's a whole range of emotions that tend to get associated when we actually feel jealous. So it's not just one emotion. So in that respect, it's not a purely emotional problem. I can feel angry, I can feel anxious, I can feel threatened, and there's a range of different responses here. It's much more about a set of beliefs which leads us to see a particular type of threat, and to then respond to that perceived threat. Yeah.
Well, in medicine, it would be called a syndrome because it consists of so many components. It's a syndrome of jealousy. Emma is actually making a very interesting point, saying, I've had an upsurge in relationship problem referrals recently, I guess during the pandemic, including precipitated by jealousy of a child and work, which when mother works from home and spends her time in front of her computer and with her work. So I can imagine that actually lockdown probably brought quite a lot of this type of problems to the surface.
Sorry.
Yeah, carry on.
I was going to say, the thing that's interesting about that, of course, is if you look at feeling jealous of work, in many, many instances, that inability, for example, of a parent to give attention because they're tied up with work, has probably gone and existed for years. So what is it about lockdown, for instance, that's made that different, or working from home that's made that different? Because strictly speaking, I see more of my parent being around when they're at home than I do when they leave every day for 8 hours or whatever it is. But I have expectations about being able to access the person, and those expectations are being blocked. Yep.
Yes, yes, I've noticed it with lockdowns, because you have certain expectations that if, say, your parent is at home, then it's a weekend and we can play all day, and it all was completely turned around, and it's quite difficult to adjust to. Before I open to questions, I wanted just to ask one little question, but briefly. If it is a relationship jealousy or family jealousy, can it be worked with one client, or it has to be worked as with couples or whole families? What do you think?
Right. It's very easy to answer this question by saying on the one hand and then on the other hand. What I'll do is I'll offer out a few practical sort of insights or tips on this. The first thing I would say is I start off from the assumption that who you work with is often dictated by factors which are external to you. Or to put that another way, there's no point in arriving at a conclusion that if you've got jealousy between a romantic couple, for example, that you've got to see both parties, because it may well be that both parties aren't willing to turn up. And I think that's particularly common, incidentally, with jealousy problems, that both parties aren't willing to turn up. So I would never have a hard and fast rule on this, simply because you could be setting yourself up to fail. The other thing I would make as a general principle is I personally think that couples work is both more demanding and also requires a different skill set to individual work, in exactly the same way, incidentally, that running therapeutic groups requires a different skill set and can often be more demanding as well. So what I would probably say is that if you have experience of working with couples, then I would be much more open to it, assuming that both parties can come along. But if you haven't, then I would be a bit wary of getting chewed up and spat out, is my honest view on it. Where's the argument strongest for seeing people as a couple? The argument's probably strongest when the behavior is creating conflict in the relationship. And that is something which both parties show some degree of evidence of wanting to resolve. And if you're dealing with that, then I think it's worth at least considering, bearing in mind the factors that I've already mentioned. Yeah. But, in my own experience, if I'm really honest with you, when I think about the proportion of clients that I've seen where jealousy is an issue and where it's been possible to work with both partners, it's been a minority on the whole.
Well, I think what you say is important, because sometimes you just need to be realistic and work with what you've got and who you've got in front of you. Just very briefly about the course on the 11th of February. will you be giving us some ways of working with this issue, other ways to help people? Just very, very briefly, because I want to let people ask some questions as well.
Okay, sure. So we're going to start off with looking at what are realistic therapeutic goals, because this is not straightforward. I've already given a sort of a hint on that. And, you know, if you are willing to accept that jealousy is a natural, normal state, then its elimination is not only unrealistic, it is arguably inadvisable as well. So the issue is never about the elimination of jealousy. It's more about the prevention of its interference in life. So we're bearing that caveat in mind, there's a variety of things that need to sort of be realized with that, which we're going to be spending our time on. We're going to be looking at certain acceptance strategies relating to feelings, which come from third wave CBT approaches. There's some work that we'll be doing at looking at weakening negative core beliefs. And particularly I wanted to look as well at issues of using quite specific behavioral experiments and continuums to actually weaken those beliefs. And probably not surprisingly, given what it is that I've actually said, we'll also be spending quite a lot of time looking at how in practice you actually help people to eliminate a whole range of behavioral responses to it, i.e. safety behaviors. Because you know, anyone that's ever been sort of eaten up by jealousy will know that the sort of behaviors that you engage in to try and cope, but which actually make the problem worse, can feel extraordinarily addictive. You know, that's one of the reasons why so many people have difficulties actually stopping them. You know, they don't want to be checking all the time, but they can't stop themselves. They don't want to put their partner through a test, but they can't stop themselves. And what do you do to help people to actually basically drop those very, very powerful and extremely unhelpful safety behaviors? Yeah. So we'll be spending time looking at that.
Yes, so I've put in the chat box the link to course on jealousy, which will be on the 11th of February. And I also put the link to the course on resentfulness and hurt, which will be on the 11th of March, because I had quite a few questions in the chat box about past hurt, past betrayal, how to deal with that. So those courses will logically sort of flow from one to another. Yes, the courses are all recorded, and if you can't attend on the day, you will receive the full recording to keep. We are now not putting any time limit on the recording. You can watch it whenever you want. You will receive the full recording about 2-3 days after the course, and you can watch it at your own time, call the office and receive your certificate. I would like to open up for questions, and if you are happy to ask your questions in person, put your electronic hand up and speak. And while we're doing that, I will have a look through the chat box whether there's anything to ask. Anybody wants to ask questions in person? Can't see anyone. I'll ask a question from Deborah here. How would you work with an adult jealous of how his parents treat his older brother, but client denies feeling jealous?
The client denies feeling jealous. Well, in a peculiar way, I don't see this as being fundamentally different from when we work with any client, where basically we can see some evidence of something occurring and the client either can't see it themselves or is not willing to talk about it. So my first thing I would always say with this is that as a therapist, there is presumably a reason why you believe this person is jealous. And it will come through from the way they behave, from the things they actually say. And I think the first step here is, to be honest with you, is catching the moment. Because I think very often a lot of this for many people isn't fully conscious. And although in a sense that, that it sticks its head out, it often sticks its head out very, very briefly. And, 5 seconds, 10 seconds after the person's manifested it, emotionally, they moved on to something else. So it's one of those things where I feel quite happy and to seize the moment. And that there will be some instances where I'd equally be quite happy to mimic what the client's done. So I might say, when you were talking about your brother and you're a bit like that, what was that about? So don't be afraid to interrupt and seize the moment and reflect it back to the client and explore with the client on it.
And I guess just correct me if I'm wrong. Is it necessary to make the client to own the problem as you see it, like jealousy, or is it important?
It's certainly where I would basically, if there is evidence, and particularly repeated evidence, of jealousy coming through in the person's behavior with you, then I'm going to make a not unreasonable assumption that that's going to leak out in other contexts as well. So it might not be directly expressed, for example, to the brother or to the parents, but I strongly expect it to leak out. So it's likely to have an effect. So if that's occurring, and I don't just mean as a one-off, but if it's occurring on a repeated basis, then it's going to end up, I would argue, having to be part of your formulation about what's going on with the client and the client's presenting problem, and will need to be addressed as well. Yeah. I mean, I'm saying all of this. Just to put a couple of caveats in there. I'm a great believer that therapists should be wary of hypothesizing. So, whenever you've got an idea in your head that something is going on, you should be able to identify for yourself the evidence that's led you to that conclusion. So if you think to yourself, I feel that my client is jealous here, if you're going to have a conversation about that, there needs to be something that you can point to that's led you to that particular conclusion. So that's one thing I would say. The other caveat I would just put in here is to say, there is certain language which people have greater difficulties owning. Anger is another example. Very often people can't talk about or accept that they feel angry. They can accept, however, that they feel annoyed or irritated. And I would show some degree of flexibility over the use of the word jealousy. It's quite a strong word for a lot of people to own. And I'll feel quite happy about allowing my client to choose their own language to describe what their experience actually is. So what I'm saying here is don't try and get them to confess that they're jealous.
Yeah.
If they're happy to describe this issue using another word or language, feel free.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, yes. And to finish, an interesting question, another thing which we haven't touched upon, and it might be interesting to try to define it. It's a question from Karen. Can you say something about mother-daughter, father-son jealousy as the child grows to adulthood and becomes prettier or stronger or better sportsman than the parent? So basically the child starts outperforming their parents. Is this competition or jealousy or both or envy? How would you define that? That's a question for you.
Right. I'm going to say that it's very natural and normal. And I would argue that it has got that clear evolutionary basis to it. Just as, sexual partners feel jealous either about losing their partner and their partner's resource provision to a third party, or whether there's jealousy because there's fear that a third party might be the recipient of the sperm of your partner and create more children. There's an evolutionary basis to that. There is exactly the same issue that's around, which relates to age and or fertility and or the ability to provide. So those things, those things are embedded in us as a species. And although, we might sit here and say, my goodness, this is so ancient. Yeah, you're quite right, it is ancient. But I will tell you now that the way we've lived, for example, over the last 50 years is far, far outweighed by our history of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So don't expect change to be around, and there's a lot of our society which is still built on that. So that's not surprising that that actually occurs. Again, can I just emphasize, it's all about the way it's managed, and it's all about the behavioral response. In that respect, I think recognition that it's there is a crucial first step, and acceptance of it, that it's there. And honesty about whether the response that you have to it is helpful or unhelpful. And then the next step is to look at how that might be managed. But I think that's, again, I don't find anything unusual, pathological about that. I think that's good. Actually, it's a very good example of, the natural nature of jealousy. But quite clearly, it can be very destructive when people behave in certain ways as a response, when they become preoccupied by it, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. When you say it's evolutionary, it immediately came to my mind. We have ducks in our garden, which have ducklings every year. And when they're little, both mother and father protects them. When they grow up, the father starts pushing them away. So he fights for the food, he pushes them away, he actually fights his own children, and we are shaken with indignation, but that's nature. That's what he does, because it's his garden, it's his territory, and he fights for it. So I'm not saying we should behave the same way, but I'm saying we're coming from the same roots. So it's not surprising that we still witness that sort of.
Can I just say with this,
yeah.
I think an honest recognition of its existence is a key first step to managing it. Yes. To deny it or to say it shouldn't exist is actually going to allow the thing to grow. And that is where you start having quite dangerous or abusive behavior occurring.
Absolutely. Well, being honest and accepting something is probably always the first step to dealing with it. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. And I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you will come to the course on jealousy, because although it's not the topic which immediately comes to mind, but hopefully we've managed to convince you that it actually is an underlying issue for many problems which our clients come to us with. So I've put the links there, and as always, you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Keep warm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you very much. That was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Look after yourselves.